My wife abandoned her autistic son 11 years ago. I raised him alone. At 17, he built a $6.2 million app. Then my ex-wife came back with a lawyer claiming his money. I panicked. Our lawyer said we might lose. But my son calmly whispered, "Just let her talk." Look, I'm not saying I'm a saint or anything, but the universe has this really twisted sense of humor when it comes to my life. And honestly, I'm starting to think someone up there is running a reality show at my expense. So there I was, standing on my porch on a perfectly mediocre Friday evening, minding my own business and contemplating whether microwave pizza counted as actual dinner or just a cry for help, when karma decided to drop-kick me straight into single fatherhood with absolutely zero warning and even less preparation. The knock came around 6:30, which should have been my first red flag because Sabrina never showed up unannounced unless she wanted something. And let me tell you, 11 years of marriage had taught me that her version of wanting something usually meant I was about to get screwed over in ways I hadn't even considered possible. I opened the door expecting maybe a forgotten sweater or some passive-aggressive comment about my lawn looking like a jungle, but instead I got the full package deal. My ex-wife, my 5-year-old son Liam, and the kind of bombshell announcement that makes you question every life choice you've ever made since middle school. Just for the weekend, Noah. I need a break, she said, and I swear to God, she delivered that line with the same energy someone uses when returning a defective toaster to Target. No explanation, no elaboration, just those 8 words that would fundamentally restructure my entire existence. She didn't even have the decency to look apologetic about it, just stood there with her designer sunglasses pushed up on her head like she was doing me some kind of favor by dumping our kid on my doorstep like an Amazon package nobody ordered. Liam was clutching this ratty stuffed dinosaur, Mr. Scales, which he'd had since he was 2, and doing that thing he does when the world gets too loud and too bright and too everything all at once. You know, that rocking motion, covering his ears with his little hands, eyes locked on the ground like if he stared hard enough at the porch boards, reality might just rearrange itself into something less terrifying. My heart broke right there, cracked clean down the middle like a cheap plate, but I kept my face neutral because the last thing this kid needed was to see his dad lose his composure while his mom was essentially abandoning him for the weekend. Sabrina didn't hug him goodbye, didn't even ruffle his hair, or do that mom thing where they pretend everything's fine while their kid's world is imploding. Nope, she just pivoted on her expensive heels, tossed out a "thanks, you're a lifesaver," like I'd agreed to water her plants, and marched back to her car with the kind of determination usually reserved for people fleeing crime scenes. I watched those taillights disappear down my street, getting smaller and smaller until they were just red dots in the distance. And I had this surreal moment where I thought maybe I was dreaming. Maybe I'd fallen asleep on the couch, and this was just some anxiety-induced nightmare my brain had cooked up. But then Liam tugged on my jeans with one hand, while keeping Mr. Scales clutched tight in the other, and reality came crashing back with the subtlety of a freight train. I looked down at this tiny human who shared my DNA and my apparent talent for getting abandoned by the same woman, and I thought, well, Noah, you've really done it now. The backpack she'd left behind was one of those cheap grocery store ones with a faded superhero on it, and when I unzipped it later that night after getting Liam settled in front of some cartoons, I found exactly 3 items. One wrinkled t-shirt that was probably 2 sizes too small, Mr. Scales' slightly less ratty cousin Mr. Chomps, and absolutely nothing else. No extra clothes, no toothbrush, no medication if he needed any, no instruction manual titled, "How to Care for Your Autistic Child, who you've basically met maybe twice since the divorce." Just those 3 items, and the implied message that I should figure it out, because apparently Google and panic were acceptable substitutes for actual parenting preparation. I sat there on my couch at like 10 p.m., holding this pathetic excuse for a survival kit, and I started laughing because if I didn't laugh, I was probably going to cry. And I'd already hit my crying quota for the year during that divorce lawyer meeting where I found out Sabrina had been cheating with her yoga instructor named. I kid you not, Brad. That first weekend was like being thrown into the ocean without swimming lessons and someone yelling, "Good luck," from the shore. Liam didn't talk much, which I'd expected based on the maybe 4 supervised visits I'd been allowed during the separation. But what I hadn't expected was just how specific his needs were, how every little thing had to be just right or the entire day would derail faster than my credit score after the divorce. He wanted scrambled eggs for breakfast, but they couldn't be too runny or too dry. Had to be exactly that Goldilocks zone of egg texture that apparently only existed in some parallel universe where I was a competent cook. The toast had to be cut diagonally, not straight across, not in triangles, but specifically from corner to corner in one clean cut, because somehow the geometry of bread affected its taste. And honestly, at that point I was ready to believe in toast astrology if it meant the kid would actually eat something. He didn't like hugs, which broke my heart because I'm a hugger, always have been. Grew up in one of those families where everyone's constantly touching and patting and showing affection through physical contact. But Liam would go rigid whenever I tried, his whole body tensing up like I'd hit him with a taser. So I learned real quick to keep my distance and show love through other means, like making sure his yellow cup was always filled with exactly 6 ounces of apple juice, no more, no less, because apparently we were running a laboratory instead of a household. Sounds were another landmine. The blender was basically a war crime. The vacuum cleaner might as well have been a torture device, and don't even get me started on the time I sneezed too loud, and he had a meltdown that lasted 45 minutes. I started moving through my own house like a ninja, tiptoeing around, communicating in whispers, turning into one of those mime artists nobody asked for. At night, he didn't sleep like normal kids. Instead, he'd hum these little tunes, repetitive melodies that would drift through the walls of his bedroom into mine, and I'd lie there in the dark listening to this soundtrack of neurological difference, wondering what the hell I'd gotten myself into, and whether CPS would arrest me for being this unprepared. Some nights I hummed too, mostly variations of "What the hell am I doing?" and "I'm so screwed" set to the tune of my own anxiety. My dating life, which had been pathetic before, was now completely non-existent because who wants to swipe right on a guy whose idea of a wild Friday night involves memorizing the specific order his kid arranges dinosaur toys? Nobody, that's who. I became fluent in exhaustion, got my PhD in winging it, and somehow managed to keep this tiny human alive through sheer stubbornness and an unhealthy reliance on delivery pizza. That weekend Sabrina mentioned? Yeah, it's been 11 years now, and I'm still waiting for her to come pick him up like she promised. 11 years of diagonal toast, humming nights, yellow cups, and slowly figuring out that my son wasn't broken or defective or any of those horrible words people whispered when they thought I couldn't hear. He was just different, wired in ways that made the world simultaneously more beautiful and more terrifying than I'd ever understood. I never got that break she talked about, never got a single phone call asking how he was doing, never received a birthday card or Christmas present or any acknowledgement that she'd birthed this incredible kid and then just left. But you know what? Fatherhood turned out to be like one of those gym memberships you accidentally sign up for while drunk. You didn't plan for it, definitely didn't budget for it, but somehow it ends up shaping you into someone you never knew you could become. And looking back, you can't imagine life without it, even though your muscles ache and you're pretty sure you're doing half the exercises wrong. So here's the thing nobody tells you about suddenly becoming a full-time parent to an autistic kid. There's no manual, no step-by-step guide, no parenting for dummies, special edition, sitting on a shelf at Barnes & Noble that could have saved me from the absolute circus my life became in those first few months. I mean, sure, I could have Googled stuff, and believe me, I did. Spent so many nights scrolling through parenting forums at 3 a.m. like some kind of desperate information vampire, reading posts from other exhausted parents who were also just making it up as they went along. But Google can't prepare you for the reality of living with a 5-year-old who operates on a completely different frequency than the rest of humanity, whose brain processes the world through filters and patterns that make perfect sense to him, but look like absolute chaos to everyone else. It was like I'd been handed this incredibly complex piece of technology with invisible fine print that read, "Content's extremely sensitive to change. Handle with care. Good luck figuring out what care actually means, sucker." The first major lesson I learned was that Liam's relationship with food made my ex-wife's restrictive juice cleanse look downright reasonable. This kid had a diet that consisted of maybe 5 items total, and I'm being generous with that count. Scrambled eggs were acceptable, but only if they were cooked in butter, not oil, and God forbid I added cheese or vegetables, or any of those things normal parents sneak into their kids' food to pretend they're being nutritious. Toast was fine, but again with the diagonal cutting situation, because apparently horizontal cuts were offensive to his entire existence. I tried making him mac and cheese one night, thinking it was a safe bet, because what kid doesn't like mac and cheese, right? Wrong. So incredibly wrong. I burned it, which honestly wasn't surprising given my cooking skills hover somewhere between college freshman and natural disaster. And when I served it to him, Liam took one look at the slightly brown edges and actually recoiled like I'd presented him with a plate of live spiders. He didn't cry or throw a tantrum. He just stared at it with this expression of profound disappointment, pushed the plate away with one finger, and went back to lining up his toy cars like nothing had happened. That's when I realized his rejection wasn't personal. It was just his way of communicating that my culinary attempt had failed to meet the very specific standards his brain required, standards I didn't even know existed until I'd already violated them. The sensory stuff was a whole other dimension of complexity that made me feel like I was living in a house made of eggshells. Liam didn't just dislike certain textures or sounds. He experienced them as physically painful, like his nervous system was constantly dialed up to 11 while the rest of us were cruising at a comfortable 5 or 6. Tags on clothing were torture devices that needed to be immediately removed with scissors, which meant I became surprisingly skilled at surgical tag removal, sitting there with my reading glasses on like some kind of demented tailor. Certain fabrics made him itch even though there was nothing medically wrong with his skin. His brain just decided that polyester was the enemy and cotton was barely acceptable. The vacuum cleaner might as well have been an air raid siren. The blender was basically announcing the apocalypse. And that one time a motorcycle drove past our house with a broken muffler, Liam spent the next hour under his bed with his hands over his ears, rocking and humming, completely unreachable. I started planning my entire day around avoiding sounds, turning off the TV before he came downstairs, doing laundry only when he was at therapy, basically transforming into a monk who'd taken a vow of silence, except I was doing it in a 3-bedroom house in suburbia, while trying to figure out if I could legally divorce a vacuum cleaner. The humming at night became our weird routine, this thing that initially drove me absolutely insane, but eventually became as familiar as my own heartbeat. Liam would lie in his bed, sheets tucked in tight, weighted blanket on top, because apparently pressure was calming, and he'd hum these wordless melodies that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his brain, like his mind was processing the entire day through music nobody else could hear. I'd lie in my own bed next door, staring at the ceiling, listening to this soundtrack, and I'd find myself humming too, except my tunes were less melodic and more like variations on the theme of "What the hell am I doing with my life?" mixed with "Please let him sleep through the night just once." Some evenings I'd hum curses into my pillow, creative combinations of profanity that would have made a sailor blush, just letting out all the frustration and fear and overwhelming sense of inadequacy that came with being solely responsible for this kid's well-being. Nobody warns you that parenting is like 50% love and 50% wondering if you're completely screwing up a tiny human's entire future, with maybe an extra 10% thrown in for good measure that's just pure exhaustion and fear. But then there were these moments, these incredible, unexpected moments, that made all the burnt mac and cheese and sleepless nights worth it. One evening about 3 months in, I found Liam in the living room with every single one of his toy cars spread out on the floor, and I was about to tell him to clean up the mess when I realized what he was actually doing. He wasn't just playing. He was organizing them in this elaborate pattern that my tired brain couldn't immediately process. At first I thought it was by size, then maybe by type, but as I got closer I realized he'd arranged them by color in these incredibly subtle gradients, like he was creating a rainbow, but with the kind of precision that would make an art gallery curator weep with joy. We're not talking basic red, blue, green sorting. This kid was working with shades, moving from crimson to scarlet to burgundy, creating these Pantone-level sequences that suggested he was seeing colors in ways my basic adult brain couldn't even comprehend. I just stood there in the doorway, frozen, watching this 5-year-old create art out of Hot Wheels, and I had this sudden thought. This boy might be seeing the Matrix, and I'm over here impressed when I match my socks. That was the turning point, the moment when something fundamental shifted in how I understood my role in Liam's life. Up until then, I'd been approaching parenting like it was a problem to solve, like if I just found the right technique or read the right book or got him to eat vegetables, somehow I could fix him into being a neurotypical kid who would make my life easier. But watching him create that color gradient made me realize that Liam wasn't broken. He was just different, and that difference wasn't something that needed fixing. It was something that needed understanding, respect, and a dad who was willing to shut up and learn instead of constantly trying to force him into a mold that was never going to fit. My whole parenting philosophy changed right there on the living room floor, surrounded by miniature vehicles. I stopped trying to make him normal and started trying to understand his version of normal, which was infinitely more complex and beautiful than anything I'd been pushing for. I adopted a new motto that night. Observe, don't interfere, unless the house is literally on fire, and even then, check if maybe the fire is part of some elaborate sensory experiment before you grab the extinguisher. I started watching how Liam moved through the world, paying attention to what made him comfortable versus what sent him into overload. I learned that he needed warnings before transitions, that surprises were his kryptonite, that routine wasn't just helpful. It was essential, like oxygen or water or those diagonal toast cuts. I figured out that his weird behaviors weren't random. They were coping mechanisms, ways his brain managed the overwhelming amount of sensory information constantly bombarding him. The hand flapping when he got excited wasn't something to discourage. It was his joy made visible. The lining up of objects wasn't obsessive. It was his way of creating order in a world that felt chaotic and unpredictable. We developed our own language, Liam and me, one that didn't always need words. He'd hand me his yellow cup when he was thirsty instead of asking. And I learned that meant he was having a nonverbal day and I should just roll with it. He'd stand near me when he wanted company but not interaction, and I'd just exist in the same space, doing whatever I was doing, giving him the comfort of presence without the demand of conversation. When he needed deep pressure, he'd walk up and lean against me like a cat, and I'd apply firm, steady pressure to his shoulders until I felt him relax. We were like two people learning to dance together, constantly adjusting our steps, occasionally stepping on each other's toes, but slowly, so incredibly slowly, finding a rhythm that worked for both of us, even if it looked absolutely nothing like what the parenting magazines suggested we should be doing. 2 months into our bizarre new routine. Right when I was starting to think maybe I could actually pull off this whole single dad thing without completely destroying a child's psyche, the universe decided it was time to yank the rug out from under me again, because apparently my life needed more plot twists than a soap opera written by someone on a serious caffeine binge. It was a Tuesday, which should have been my first clue that something terrible was coming because nothing good ever happens on a Tuesday. Mondays get all the hate, sure, but Tuesdays are when the universe really sharpens its knives and decides to carve up your existence just for entertainment. I was in the kitchen attempting to make chicken nuggets, which sounds simple enough, except I have this supernatural ability to mess up even the most basic foods, like my kitchen actively conspires against me producing anything edible. The oven was doing its thing. Smoke was starting to curl out because apparently I'd set the temperature to incinerate instead of bake, and I was juggling a spatula and my phone when Sabrina's name lit up the screen. My stomach dropped immediately because in 2 months she hadn't called once, not to check on Liam, not to ask how he was adjusting. Not even one of those fake, just thinking about you guys texts that people send when they're pretending to care. Radio silence. Complete and total absence. So seeing her name pop up triggered every alarm bell in my nervous system, sent my anxiety spiraling into territories I didn't even know existed. I answered with a cautious hello, like I was defusing a bomb, which honestly wasn't far from the truth given. Sabrina's talent for detonating my life at the most inconvenient moments. Her voice came through flat and emotionless, that particular tone she used when she'd already made a decision and was just going through the motions of informing the other party, like when she'd told me she wanted a divorce while I was in the middle of brushing my teeth. "I can't do this, Noah. He's yours now." 6 words. That's all she said. 6 words that fundamentally restructured my entire future, redefined my identity, and confirmed what I'd been suspecting but desperately hoping wasn't true, that the woman I'd married, the woman I'd built a life with, was capable of abandoning her own child with less ceremony than someone canceling a gym membership. Before I could respond, Before I could ask what the hell she meant by "can't do this," or demand some kind of explanation, or even just scream into the phone like a rational person whose life was imploding, I heard the click. Line dead. Conversation over. Apparently, my ex-wife had adopted the communication style of a mafia hitman. Deliver the message, hang up, disappear into the night. I just stood there in my kitchen, phone still pressed to my ear even though the line had gone dead, listening to that flat dial tone while smoke continued to billow from the oven where chicken nuggets were dying a slow, painful death that probably violated several Geneva Conventions. My brain was trying to process what had just happened, running through possible interpretations, desperately searching for some alternative meaning to "he's yours now" that didn't involve permanent abandonment. Maybe she meant for the month. Maybe she was going through something and needed more time. Maybe this was some kind of weird test of my commitment. But deep down, in that gut-level place where you know things before your brain catches up, I understood exactly what she meant. Liam wasn't a temporary responsibility anymore, wasn't a weekend favor or a shared custody arrangement. He was mine. Completely, permanently, terrifyingly mine. The smoke alarm decided that was the perfect moment to join the chaos, shrieking through the house like a banshee with a megaphone, and I scrambled to open the oven and rescue what was left of dinner, which turned out to be charcoal nuggets that bore only a passing resemblance to actual food. I was standing there waving a dish towel at the smoke detector, still processing the phone call, when Liam wandered into the kitchen with that particular expression he got when the world was being too loud and too much. He didn't say anything. He rarely did back then, just walked right up to me, held out his yellow cup with both hands like he was presenting an offering to some ancient deity, and waited. No acknowledgement of the smoke, no questions about why I looked like I'd just witnessed the apocalypse, just that simple gesture. Cup empty, please fill. That's when it hit me, really hit me, what had just happened. I wasn't the babysitter anymore, wasn't the weekend parent or the secondary option or the guy who got his kid every other holiday and alternating Thursdays. I was the dad, the only dad, the full-time, round-the-clock, no backup plan, sole provider of diagonal toast dad. And you know what the really messed up part was? Liam didn't even know his world had just shifted on its axis. To him, this was just another Tuesday where the smoke alarm was screaming and his dad was acting weird and his cup needed filling. His routine hadn't changed because from his perspective, nothing had changed. He'd been here for 2 months already, and his 5-year-old brain probably figured this was just how things were now. But I knew that Sabrina wasn't coming back for him, wasn't going to show up next weekend or next month with an apology and a renewed commitment to motherhood. She'd made her choice, delivered it in 6 words, and hung up. I filled his yellow cup with exactly 6 ounces of apple juice, muscle memory by this point, and handed it back to him. He took it, nodded once in that solemn way he had, and wandered back toward the living room where his cars were probably still arranged in their color-coded glory. I watched him go, this tiny human in dinosaur pajamas who'd just been permanently abandoned by his mother and didn't even know it yet, and I felt this weird mix of rage and protectiveness and terror wash over me in waves. Rage at Sabrina for being so spectacularly selfish, for creating a child, and then just opting out when things got difficult, for choosing her own comfort over her son's well-being without even the decency of a real conversation. Protectiveness toward Liam, this fierce, almost violent need to shield him from every hurt, every disappointment, every person who would ever make him feel like he was too much or not enough. And terror. God, so much terror, because I had no idea what I was doing, no preparation for this role, no confidence that I could actually pull off being the sole parent to a kid with needs I was still learning to understand. The funny part, and by funny I mean cosmically ironic in a way that made me want to laugh and cry simultaneously, was that Sabrina had left saying she needed space. Well, congratulations, Sabrina, you got it. 11 years worth of space. Enough space to fit an entire childhood, countless milestones, thousands of diagonal toast breakfasts, and one kid who learned pretty early that some people are only capable of loving you from a distance, and by distance I mean from another state where they can pretend you don't exist. She got all the space anyone could ever want, and I got Liam, which honestly sounds like I got the infinitely better deal except I was too terrified to appreciate it at the time. I cleaned up the kitchen in a daze, scraping cremated chicken nuggets into the trash and wondering what the hell I was supposed to feed a kid who only ate 5 things and I'd just destroyed one of them. Ended up making scrambled eggs at 7 p.m. like some kind of breakfast-obsessed psychopath, cutting toast into perfect diagonal lines while my hands shook slightly from residual adrenaline. Liam ate without comment, probably because in his world, eggs for dinner was no weirder than anything else adults did. After he was settled in bed, humming his nightly melodies, I sat on my couch in the dark and let myself have exactly 5 minutes of panic. 5 minutes to imagine all the ways I could fail this kid, all the mistakes I'd inevitably make, all the therapy bills we both probably rack up. 5 minutes to mourn the life I'd thought I was going to have, the one with weekends to myself and dating prospects and the freedom to be spontaneous. Then I picked up my phone, started researching autism specialists in my area, and got to work. Because here's what I learned that night. You can either spend your energy being angry at people who abandoned you, or you can spend it building something better for the people who stayed. Sabrina chose space. I chose Liam. And honestly, even terrified, even completely unprepared, even knowing I was probably going to screw up more times than I could count, I knew I'd made the right choice. Or maybe the choice had been made for me. Either way, I was all in now. No safety net, no backup plan, no weekend breaks. Just me, a 5-year-old who saw the world in patterns I was still learning to recognize, and a whole lot of diagonal toast in our future. Raising Liam turned out to be less like traditional parenting and more like managing a startup that had exactly one investor, me. And that investor had no idea what he was doing, but was too committed to quit now because bankruptcy wasn't just financial, it was emotional, and I'd already sunk everything I had into this venture. Our life became this incredibly structured routine that would have made a military drill sergeant nod in approval, because I learned pretty quickly that deviation from the schedule wasn't just inconvenient, it was catastrophic. We're talking full meltdown, hours of recovery time, and me questioning every decision I'd ever made since deciding to skip that career aptitude test in high school. So I became a creature of habit, which was hilarious considering I'd spent most of my 20s being that guy who showed up to things late with wet hair and a vague excuse about traffic. But suddenly, I was Mr. Punctuality, Mr. Routine, Mr. Same breakfast every single day or the world ends. The mornings always started the same way. 6:30 a.m., my alarm would go off, and I'd stumble into the kitchen like a zombie extra from a low-budget horror film to start the sacred ritual of breakfast preparation. Scrambled eggs, cooked in butter, stirred exactly 47 times. Yes, Liam counted once and informed me that 46 was insufficient and 48 was excessive, so 47 became the magic number. 2 pieces of toast, cut diagonally. No butter because apparently butter on toast was a sensory nightmare, but butter in eggs was perfectly acceptable, and don't even try to understand the logic because I gave up on that around month 3. 6 ounces of apple juice in the yellow cup, never the blue cup or the red cup, only yellow, because colors apparently affected taste in ways my primitive adult brain couldn't comprehend. This was our routine, our foundation, the thing that made the rest of the day possible. Then came the drive to therapy, which happened 3 times a week and cost more than my car payment. But honestly, I would have sold a kidney if it meant helping Liam navigate a world that seemed designed specifically to overwhelm kids like him. We took the same route every single time. Left out of our driveway, right on Maple Street, straight through 4 lights, left on Harrison Avenue. Park in spot number 7 if available, or spot number 12 if 7 was taken, never any other spot, because apparently parking spaces had hierarchies I wasn't aware of. The therapist, Dr. Monica Chun, was this incredibly patient woman who seemed to understand Liam's brain better than I understood my own, and she'd work with him on social skills, communication strategies, and sensory integration techniques that sounded like something from a science fiction novel, but actually seemed to help. I'd sit in the waiting room drinking terrible coffee from a machine that probably hadn't been cleaned since the Clinton administration, scrolling through my phone and pretending I wasn't eavesdropping on other parents who all looked as exhausted and confused as I felt. Bedtime was another sacred ritual that required precision timing and absolute consistency. 8 p.m. every night, no exceptions, no negotiations. Bath first. Water exactly 94 degrees because 93 was too cold and 95 was too hot. And yes, I bought a thermometer specifically for this purpose, and no, I'm not ashamed of it. Then pajamas, the soft cotton ones with no tags. laid out on his bed in the exact order he needed to put them on because apparently getting dressed required a specific sequence or the entire operation would fail. Teeth brushing took exactly 2 minutes, timed with the electric toothbrush that played a song. And if that toothbrush ever died, I was pretty sure our entire evening routine would collapse like a house of cards in a hurricane. Then into bed, weighted blanket position just right, Mr. Scales the dinosaur placed on the left pillow, room temperature at 71 degrees, nightlight on, door open exactly 6 inches. Not 5, not 7. Exactly 6 because apparently door width affected sleep quality in ways that would probably require a PhD to understand. And then came the sentence, the same sentence every single night for 3 years. Good night, champ. I'd say it from the doorway. He'd hum in response. And I'd close that door to exactly 6 inches and retreat to my own room to collapse like a marathon runner who'd just discovered there were actually 5 more miles left. This was our life, this incredibly structured, precisely calibrated existence where spontaneity went to die and routine was king. My friends, the ones who still called occasionally before realizing I was basically unavailable for anything that didn't happen between 8 p.m. and 6:30 a.m., thought I was crazy. Just let him be flexible. They'd say, like flexibility was something you could just decide to teach a kid whose brain was literally wired differently. He needs to learn to adapt, they'd suggest, as if adaptation was a skill you could download like an app and not something that required years of therapy and patience and acceptance. But then came the moments that made all the routine and rigidity worth it. These small victories that felt like winning the lottery except better because they weren't about luck, they were about progress. When Liam was 8 years old, which meant we'd been doing this dance together for 3 years at that point, he asked his first full question. Not a request, not a demand, but an actual question that required thought and understanding and a level of social awareness I'd been wondering if he'd ever develop. We were in the kitchen, naturally, me making breakfast on a Saturday morning, probably thinking about whether I needed to buy more eggs because we went through them like a restaurant, when Liam looked up from his perfectly arranged row of toy cars and said, "Why did Mom leave?" I nearly dropped the frying pan, which would have been tragic because then breakfast would have been ruined and we'd have had to navigate the crisis of altered routine on top of this emotional bombshell. My brain went into overdrive, running through all possible responses. The comforting lie, the age-appropriate deflection, the "we'll talk about it when you're older" cop-out that parents use when they don't want to deal with hard truths. But looking at his face, at those serious eyes that seemed to see through all the adult nonsense straight to the core of things, I realized he deserved better than a comfortable lie. So I told him the truth, or at least a version of it that an 8-year-old could process. She said she couldn't handle it. I said, keeping my voice steady even though inside I was screaming 1,000 different variations of how unfair it all was. He nodded once, this solemn little nod like a tiny philosopher who'd just confirmed a theory about the fundamental nature of reality, and then went back to eating his eggs. That was it. No tears, no follow-up questions, no dramatic emotional breakdown. Just acceptance, like he'd asked about the weather and gotten a satisfactory answer. The kid was stoic in ways that made ancient Greek philosophers look emotionally unstable, and I stood there at the stove thinking, this is my son, this incredible little human who processes abandonment the same way he processes information about dinosaur species, as just another fact to categorize and file away. It was simultaneously heartbreaking and amazing, this glimpse into how his brain worked, how he took something that would have destroyed most kids and just integrated it into his worldview without all the messy emotional drama the rest of us would have indulged in. That became our relationship, this quiet understanding between two people who didn't need a lot of words to communicate what mattered. We met in the middle. I learned to respect his need for routine, and he learned to tolerate my occasional mistakes when I forgot to cut the toast correctly or accidentally bought the wrong brand of apple juice. Zero drama, which was refreshing after years of being married to someone who turned every disagreement into a theatrical production worthy of Broadway. Liam didn't do small talk, didn't waste time on pleasantries or social niceties that most people use to fill awkward silences. He was direct, honest to the point of being brutal sometimes, and refreshingly incapable of the kind of manipulation and passive aggression that had defined my marriage. We developed this shorthand, this language of gestures and routines that probably looked weird to outsiders, but worked perfectly for us. He'd line up his cars in the morning while I made breakfast, and I could tell by the specific pattern he chose what kind of day he was anticipating. Tight. Orderly rows meant he was feeling anxious. Loose groupings meant he was relaxed. Color gradients meant he was in a creative mood. I'd adjust my approach accordingly, give him more space or more structure depending on what his car arrangements were telling me. It was like learning to read a completely different language, one written in toy vehicles and breakfast preferences and the exact angle of door openings. By the time he was 10, we had our system down so well we could have written a manual, except nobody would have believed that this level of structure was necessary or even possible. We were like a two-person dance troupe who'd practiced the same routine so many times we didn't even need to think about the steps anymore. He knew I'd always cut the toast diagonally. I knew he'd always need the yellow cup. We both knew that 8 p.m. meant bedtime and 6:30 a.m. meant breakfast, and Tuesdays and Thursdays meant therapy. The predictability that would have driven most people insane became our comfort, our safety net, the thing that made both our lives manageable in a world that seemed determined to be chaotic and unpredictable. And through it all, I learned that parenting isn't about forcing your kid to fit some predetermined mold of what children are supposed to be. It's about figuring out who they actually are and building a life that lets them be that person safely and happily. Liam didn't need me to fix him or change him or make him more like other kids. He needed me to accept him, understand him, and create an environment where his particular brand of brilliant could flourish without constantly being told it was wrong. When Liam was 9 years old, I learned that the American education system, that glorious institution we're all supposed to trust with our children's futures, was about as equipped to handle neurodivergent kids as I was equipped to perform open-heart surgery, which is to say not at all, and also maybe we should all be concerned about that. It started with a phone call from Lincoln Elementary, which already had me on edge because schools never call with good news. Nobody ever picks up the phone to say, "Hey, your kid is doing great. Just wanted to spread some joy." It's always some variation of "we need to talk" delivered in that specific tone that makes your stomach drop into your shoes. The secretary, Mrs. Patterson, who sounded like she'd been working in school administration since the invention of the telephone, informed me in her nasally voice that Principal Tuttle needed to see me at my earliest convenience, which is adult speak for "get down here immediately" or "we're calling CPS." I showed up the next morning after dropping Liam off at class, walking into that principal's office like I was heading to my own execution, because I developed this Pavlovian response to school meetings where my anxiety levels automatically skyrocketed the moment I entered a building that smelled like industrial cleaner and broken dreams. Principal Tuttle was this middle-aged guy with a comb-over that defied physics and a suit that probably looked professional in 1987, sitting behind his desk with a folder full of what I assumed were complaints about my kid. He launched into his speech without preamble, no small talk. No "how are you doing?" Just straight into the corporate-approved script about how Liam was too disruptive for the regular classroom environment and how they thought he'd be better served in their special education program, which anyone who's ever dealt with the school system knows is code for "we don't want to deal with your difficult kid, so we're going to warehouse him with minimal resources and lower expectations." Too disruptive, I repeated, letting the words hang in the air like a bad smell. "Can you elaborate on what exactly is disruptive about him?" Tuttle shuffled some papers, clearly uncomfortable, and started listing incidents that made me want to flip his desk over like some kind of unhinged action hero. Apparently Liam was disruptive because he corrected his math teacher's incorrect answer on the board, not rudely, just matter-of-factly pointed out that 7 times 8 was 56, not 54, which seemed like something a teacher should appreciate, but apparently pointing out adult mistakes was a cardinal sin. He was disruptive because he'd finished his work in 15 minutes and then started reading a book about coding instead of sitting quietly and pretending to be busy like everyone else. He was disruptive because he'd told another student that their presentation on the solar system was factually inaccurate, which, okay, maybe could have been phrased more diplomatically, but since when is accuracy disruption? I sat there listening to this list of grievances that basically amounted to, "your son is too smart and too honest, and we don't know what to do with that." And I felt my blood pressure rising to levels that probably required medical intervention. Let me get this straight. I said, keeping my voice level even though internally I was screaming. My son is being punished for being correct, for finishing his work efficiently, and for having standards about factual accuracy. That's what we're calling disruptive now. Tuttle did that thing administrators do where they smile condescendingly and say something about social skills and fitting in with peers and the importance of learning to work within the system, which is basically adult speak for, we want compliant robots, not thinking humans. That's when he dropped the real bomb, the actual reason for this meeting. We think Liam would benefit from our specialized learning program, he said, sliding a pamphlet across the desk like he was offering me a vacation package instead of proposing to drastically lower the educational ceiling for my kid. I picked up the pamphlet, which featured smiling children engaged in what the school district probably called adaptive learning, but what looked suspiciously like arts and crafts and remedial math. This is the classroom where ambition goes to die, I said, and I wasn't even trying to be dramatic. I was just stating facts. You want to put my son, who's teaching himself Python in his spare time and correcting your teacher's math, in a room where the highest expectation is that maybe he'll learn to count change. The meeting went downhill from there, with Tuttle getting defensive and throwing around phrases like best interests of the child and professional recommendations, while I countered with increasingly aggressive questions about why accommodating a smart kid who happened to be autistic was somehow impossible in a school that claimed to value diversity and inclusion in every piece of literature they sent home. We went in circles for 45 minutes, him insisting that Liam needed to be separated from the mainstream population, me insisting that what Liam actually needed was teachers who could handle a student who was smarter than they were. Eventually, Tuttle pulled out the big guns, suggesting that if I wasn't willing to accept their recommendation, perhaps Liam would be better suited to a different school entirely, which was basically a threat wrapped in bureaucratic language. I left that office shaking with rage, the kind of anger that makes you want to write strongly worded letters to the superintendent and possibly the governor, and maybe just start a whole new school system from scratch. But anger without action is just therapy you can't afford. So I did what any parent in the 21st century does when faced with institutional incompetence. I researched the hell out of educational rights for disabled students. Spent the next week becoming an expert on the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, Section 504 accommodations, and every legal protection available to kids like Liam. Downloaded forms, printed out guidelines, highlighted relevant passages until my apartment looked like a law office had exploded. I called other parents, joined online support groups, talked to advocates who'd been through this battle before, and armed myself with enough information to go to war with an entire school district. The next meeting was a week later, except this time I brought reinforcements. I showed up with a special education advocate named Patricia who'd been doing this for 20 years and had a reputation for making administrators cry, a folder full of documentation about Liam's abilities and needs, and a recorder to document everything said, because I'd learned that schools suddenly became very careful with their words when they knew they were being recorded. We sat down across from Tuttle and the special education coordinator, a woman named Ms. Ramirez, who looked like she'd rather be literally anywhere else, and I laid out exactly what accommodations Liam needed to stay in the mainstream classroom. Preferential seating away from sensory triggers, the ability to take movement breaks when needed, access to advanced materials when he finished work early, and teachers who understood that correcting factual errors wasn't insubordination, it was intellectual engagement. Tuttle tried to push back, claiming budget constraints and resource limitations, and all the usual excuses schools use when they don't want to make any effort, but Patricia shut him down with the kind of legal knowledge that made it clear this wasn't a negotiation, it was a notification of what the law required them to provide. You can provide these accommodations willingly, she said in this sweet voice that somehow contained an iron core, or we can file for due process and let a judge explain your legal obligations. But either way, these accommodations will be provided. There's something beautiful about watching a bureaucrat realize they've lost, this moment where their face goes through several stages of denial before settling on resignation. We walked out of there an hour later with a signed accommodation plan that guaranteed Liam could stay in regular classes with the support he actually needed. At home that night, while I was making our ritual diagonal toast and trying to decompress from a week of fighting the education system, Liam came into the kitchen carrying his backpack. He pulled out a folder and started organizing the papers inside. Homework assignments, permission slips, those terrible standardized test prep worksheets that somehow always ended up crumpled at the bottom of his bag, and I watched him sort everything by date and category with the kind of efficiency that would make a professional organizer weep with joy. "Dad, you mixed the therapy notes with the medical receipts," he said without looking up, pointing to my own disorganized pile of paperwork on the counter. He was right, of course, because he was always right about these things, and I felt this wave of affection mixed with amusement wash over me. "You're absolutely right, champ," I said, and I meant it. Here I was, fighting to keep him in classes that would challenge his incredible brain, and he was casually pointing out my organizational failures like a miniature accountant who'd stumbled across some seriously concerning financial records. That was the day I really understood what I'd been fighting for. Not just the right for him to stay in mainstream classes, but the recognition that his way of seeing the world, his attention to detail, his insistence on accuracy and order, wasn't a disability to be managed. It was a gift to be nurtured. He didn't just understand patterns. He was one himself, this precise, efficient, terrifyingly smart little human who saw connections and categories that the rest of us missed completely. The school wanted to put him in a box labeled special needs and forget about him. I was determined to blow that box apart and let him show everyone exactly what he was capable of, diagonal toast and all. At 12 years old, Liam discovered coding, and I'm not talking about the kind of casual, "let's try this fun app that teaches kids basic programming" discovery that normal parents brag about on Facebook. I'm talking about full-blown obsession, the kind where he'd disappear into his room for hours and emerge with functioning programs that did things I didn't even know computers could do. And suddenly, I was living with a preteen who spoke fluent Python while I was still struggling to remember my email password. It started innocently enough. He'd asked for a laptop for his birthday, which seemed reasonable since every kid his age was glued to some kind of screen anyway, and I figured at least coding was more productive than watching YouTube videos of people playing video games, which is apparently what passes for entertainment these days. I bought him this mid-range Dell that the guy at Best Buy assured me was perfect for students. And within 3 days, Liam had customized the entire operating system, installed a dozen programming environments, and built his first application, which was a simple organizer for his toy car collection that tracked color, size, make, and model with the efficiency of a professional database. Most kids his age were still figuring out how to ride bikes without training wheels, learning to throw a baseball without accidentally beaming their dads in the face, or discovering that girls didn't actually have cooties. My kid was learning Python, JavaScript, and SQL like they were second languages, staying up until midnight writing code that I couldn't understand even when he tried to explain it to me using small words and visual aids like I was a particularly slow kindergartner. He'd come to dinner, scrambled eggs and diagonal toast, because some things never change, with his laptop balanced on his knees, typing away while eating with one hand, completely absorbed in whatever program he was building that week. I'd given up trying to enforce no screens at the table, because honestly, watching him code was like watching an artist paint or a musician compose. And who was I to interrupt genius just because Emily Post said electronics and dinner didn't mix? The programs he built were disturbingly useful, like someone had taken all the organizational skills I'd failed to develop over 30-something years and compressed them into algorithms. He created a file sorting system that automatically organized my work documents by date, client, and project type, which sounds simple until you realize I'd been manually searching through hundreds of files like some kind of digital caveman. He built an error flagging program that scanned my emails before I sent them and highlighted typos, grammatical mistakes, and instances where I'd accidentally written regards as retards, which had happened more than once and nearly cost me a client. He even programmed a digital assistant that would literally yell at me. Well, display aggressive pop-up notifications when I forgot to pay bills on time, which happened frequently because my ADHD brain treated deadlines as gentle suggestions rather than actual requirements. One evening, while I was attempting to make dinner and failing spectacularly as usual, Liam looked up from his laptop and said something that hit me harder than any philosophical statement from an actual philosopher. "I like computers. They don't lie." Just 7 words, delivered in his characteristic flat tone, no emotional inflection, but carrying the weight of 12 years of experience with humans who'd disappointed him. I stood there at the stove, spatula frozen in midair, processing what he'd just said and feeling my heart crack a little because I knew exactly who he was thinking about. His mother, obviously, who'd lied when she said, just for the weekend, and never came back. But also probably teachers who'd promised to understand and then recommended warehousing him in special ed. Maybe even me. All the times I'd said, I'll figure it out, when I had no idea what I was doing and was just desperately improvising my way through parenting an autistic kid. Computers didn't lie. They did exactly what you programmed them to do, followed rules consistently, didn't change their behavior based on mood or convenience, didn't promise one thing and deliver another. For a kid whose entire world operated on routine and predictability, whose brain struggled with the ambiguity and inconsistency of human behavior, computers were perfect. They were safe. They made sense in ways people never would. And yeah, that made me a little sad, understanding that my son found more reliability in silicon and code than in human relationships, but I also got it. People had let him down. Computers never would, as long as the code was solid. He started scanning everything, and I mean everything, with the dedication of someone who decided to digitize the entire physical world just to prove it was possible. School notes got photographed, cropped, and filed in organized folders with tags and metadata. Bank records were scanned and processed through programs that tracked spending patterns and flagged unusual expenses. My old grocery receipts, which I'd been throwing in a drawer like some kind of financial hoarder, got scanned, analyzed, and turned into spreadsheets that showed me exactly how much money I was wasting on impulse purchases and overpriced coffee. He built a receipt scanning app that could read the faded text on thermal paper that was half decomposed, extract relevant information, categorize purchases, and generate monthly reports that were more detailed than anything my accountant had ever provided. I thought he was just being his usual obsessively organized self, taking his need for order and structure to the next logical level by imposing it on the physical chaos of our household. What I didn't realize was that he was quietly building a digital fortress, creating an archive of documentation so comprehensive and well-organized that it would make the Library of Congress look like a messy teenager's bedroom. Every piece of paper that entered our house got scanned, processed, and backed up to multiple cloud servers with redundancy that would make an IT security professional weep with joy. He had records of everything: school communications, medical appointments, therapy notes, even the pizza delivery receipts from 3 years ago when I'd ordered too much food because I couldn't do math after midnight. Meanwhile, I was developing my own coping mechanisms for life as a single dad raising a genius who was simultaneously easier and more complicated than any parenting book had prepared me for. Sarcasm became my primary language, the defensive wall I built around the exhaustion and uncertainty that came with this territory. When other parents at school events would ask how I was doing, I'd respond with something like, "Oh, you know, living the dream, one diagonal toast at a time," delivered with enough humor to mask the fact that I was genuinely struggling but too proud to admit it. When my ex-mother-in-law, who'd disappeared along with her daughter, but suddenly had opinions about my parenting after seeing Liam featured in some local gifted students article, called to suggest I was pushing him too hard, I told her that the only thing I was pushing was my luck that I hadn't completely screwed up this kid yet, and also maybe she could redirect her parenting advice to her daughter who'd abandoned her own child. Just a thought. My life motto evolved into something between a joke and a survival strategy. If you can't afford therapy, try humor and caffeine. And I needed both in industrial quantities because raising Liam was like running a marathon where the finish line kept moving and also sometimes the track was on fire and occasionally people would show up to tell me I was doing it wrong. The humor kept me sane when I wanted to scream into a pillow about the unfairness of doing this alone. The caffeine kept me awake during those nights when Liam was deep into a coding project and needed someone to bounce ideas off, even if that someone understood maybe 10% of what he was saying and just nodded along while internally wondering if Python was actually a snake or a programming language or somehow both. We fell into this comfortable rhythm, Liam and me, where he'd code and I'd hover nearby, pretending to understand, where he'd organize everything and I'd mess it up just enough to give him something to fix, where he'd point out my mistakes with brutal honesty, and I'd respond with sarcastic commentary that made him smile, even though he claimed not to get humor. Our relationship was built on mutual acceptance of each other's weirdness, his need for routine and structure, my tendency toward chaos and last-minute panic. He tolerated my disorganization and terrible cooking. I tolerated his correction of my grammar and his insistence that there was a right way to load the dishwasher, which apparently I'd been doing wrong for 12 years. Some nights I'd find him still awake at 11 p.m., glow of his laptop screen illuminating his face in the dark, fingers flying across the keyboard with the kind of focus that most people never achieve in their entire lives. I'd lean against his doorframe and watch him work. This kid who'd been handed a rough deal by the universe. Autism, abandonment, a dad who was making it up as he went along, but who'd somehow turned it all into fuel for creating something extraordinary. He wasn't building programs just to build them. He was constructing his own version of order in a world that had proven itself unreliable. Every line of code was another brick in the fortress he was building against chaos and disappointment. And maybe that should have worried me. This 12-year-old who trusted computers more than people, but honestly, given the people who'd let him down, I couldn't blame him one bit. At least computers never promised to come back for the weekend and then disappeared for 11 years. At 17 years old, Liam had transformed from that 5-year-old who rocked on my porch covering his ears into this lanky teenager who still rocked occasionally, but now did it while debugging code that looked like alien hieroglyphics to my untrained eyes. He'd grown into his height awkwardly, all elbows and knees like a baby giraffe learning to walk, but his mind had sharpened into something that honestly terrified me a little bit, because I was pretty sure he was smarter than everyone I'd ever met combined, including that physics professor I had in college who could calculate pi to 30 digits while drunk. Our routine had evolved, but not fundamentally changed. He still needed his diagonal toast, still used the yellow cup, still hummed at night. But now he also had a desktop setup that looked like it belonged at NASA, with multiple monitors displaying code and data visualizations that could have been modern art for all I understood them. It was a random Tuesday in March. Because apparently Tuesdays were just cosmically determined to be the days when my life took unexpected turns. When Liam called me into his room with an urgency that immediately triggered my parental anxiety, because he never showed urgency about anything except maybe running out of apple juice or someone cutting toast horizontally like a monster. I walked in expecting to troubleshoot some computer problem, maybe help him find a file he'd misplaced, which would have been ironic given that he was approximately 10,000 times more organized than I'd ever be. Instead, I found him sitting at his desk, all 3 monitors glowing with what looked like official documents, legal papers, and bank statements that had way too many zeros to be anything I was involved with, because my bank account was usually fighting for its life around 3 digits. "Dad, I sold my app," he said, and the casual way he delivered this information reminded me of how he'd told me at age 8 that he'd reorganized my entire filing system, like it was just another Tuesday task he'd checked off his list. I was still processing the sentence, my tired dad brain trying to figure out which app he was talking about, because he'd built approximately 75 different programs over the years, when he continued. "Cool. How much?" I asked, going for supportive dad energy while internally hoping it was enough to maybe buy some new clothes because the kid had grown 4 inches in 6 months and none of his pants fit anymore. Everything was suddenly high waters like he was preparing for a flood. $6.2 million, he said, turning one of his monitors toward me, and I just stood there blinking like someone had hit me with a flashbang grenade because surely I'd misheard. Surely he meant 6,000 or 60,000. Some number that made sense in the realm of teenage app development. 6.2 million what? I asked, my brain refusing to make the logical leap. Naira? Pesos? Monopoly money? Because there was no way, absolutely no possible way. My 17-year-old son had just casually informed me he'd sold something for 6.2 million actual US dollars while sitting in his bedroom wearing a dinosaur t-shirt he'd had since he was 14 and refused to throw out despite the holes in the armpits. He turned the screen, and there it was in official banking documentation that looked way too legitimate to be some kind of elaborate prank. $6.2 million, deposited into an account he'd apparently set up himself, complete with tax withholdings and legal contracts that I definitely should have known about, but clearly didn't because my son had gone ahead and conducted a multi-million-dollar business transaction without mentioning it even once during our dinner conversations. Dollars, he confirmed, in that flat tone he used when stating obvious facts, like I was the one being weird for not immediately understanding that my teenage son was now a millionaire. US dollars. The company is based in Delaware but operates internationally. They wanted the app for document verification across their entire platform. I retained 20% equity and got the upfront payment. I had to sit down on his bed because my legs had apparently forgotten how to function, and my brain was doing that thing where it tries to process too much information at once and just starts playing circus music instead. Apparently, and he explained this to me with the patience of someone teaching a golden retriever to do calculus. He'd built an app that verified document authenticity using some combination of metadata analysis, digital fingerprinting, and machine learning algorithms that I absolutely did not understand even when he drew diagrams. Basically, it was a digital truth detector that could look at any document, contracts, certificates, identification, financial records, and tell you within seconds whether it was legitimate or forged. Like Sherlock Holmes with Wi-Fi, I said, and he actually cracked a small smile at that, which meant my analogy was probably more accurate than I'd intended. The app had apparently caught the attention of some tech company that specialized in fraud prevention, and they'd been in negotiations for 3 months. 3 months during which I'd had no idea my son was conducting business deals that involved more money than I'd earned in my entire lifetime. He'd handled everything himself. Lawyers, contracts, negotiations, tax implications, all while maintaining his perfect grades and still eating diagonal toast every morning like the world hadn't just shifted on its axis. Why didn't you tell me? I asked, not angry, just genuinely confused about why he'd gone through this entire process solo. He shrugged, eyes still on his monitors. I wanted to make sure it was real first. People lie, but contracts are binding. The media came calling within a week, because apparently 17-year-old millionaire app developers make for great human interest stories, especially when that 17-year-old also happens to be autistic and was abandoned by his mother as a child. The reporters loved that angle, kept trying to spin it into some kind of inspiration porn about overcoming adversity. Liam agreed to exactly one interview with a local tech news outlet, and I sat off camera watching him handle questions with the same flat honesty he applied to everything in life. When they asked him why he'd built the app, I expected some rehearsed answer about innovation or helping people or making the world better, all the corporate nonsense that usually accompanies these kinds of stories. Instead, he just looked directly at the camera and said, because people lie. Data doesn't. The reporter clearly didn't know what to do with that, tried to get him to elaborate, to soften it, to make it more palatable for the audience who wanted inspirational content, not uncomfortable truths. But Liam just repeated it. People lie. Documents lie. Data tells the truth if you know how to read it. I nearly spit out my coffee in the back of the room because that was definitely a jab, maybe not intentionally, but definitely present, at his mother, at everyone who'd ever made promises they didn't keep, at a world that ran on half-truths and social niceties while he operated in binary code, where things were either true or false with no gray area in between. For a week after the interview aired, we were on cloud 9. The money hit his account. We celebrated with fancy diagonal toast, which was just regular toast from more expensive bread. But hey, we were nouveau riche now and could afford the organic stuff. I took him to dinner at an actual restaurant that had cloth napkins and a wine list, watched him order scrambled eggs because of course he did. Routine transcended even millionaire status. We talked about college funds and investments and maybe buying a house that wasn't held together by hope and questionable plumbing. He showed me his plans for the money. Scholarships for autistic students, funding for autism research, investments in assistive technology, all these incredibly mature financial decisions that made me realize my son had somehow bypassed normal teenager brain development and gone straight to responsible adult. I felt like maybe, just maybe, we'd finally caught a break. Like the universe had decided to stop dumping complications on us and had instead delivered this massive win that would make everything easier. We could afford better therapy, better schools, better everything. Liam could pursue any career he wanted without worrying about student loans or financial pressure. I could maybe finally relax a little bit, stop living paycheck to paycheck, while fighting with insurance companies and school districts. For 1 week, I let myself believe that the hard part was over, that we'd made it through the gauntlet and come out the other side into some kind of promised land where autistic kids got recognized for their brilliance and single dads got to breathe easy. Then one Tuesday, because of course it was a Tuesday, the universe's favorite day for destroying my peace, the doorbell rang at exactly 3:30 p.m. I answered it expecting a package or maybe a door-to-door salesperson I could passive-aggressively ignore, but instead I got a ghost from the past dressed in designer clothes and carrying what appeared to be a legal briefcase. Sabrina stood there on my porch looking like guilt had gotten a makeover and decided to show up 11 years late, flanked by some guy in an expensive suit who had that predatory lawyer energy, the kind that smells like billable hours and morally flexible ethics. She smiled, actually had the audacity to smile, and said in this voice dripping with false warmth, "Liam, sweetie, Mommy's back." Cloud 9 evaporated instantly, replaced by what I can only describe as storm season, and suddenly that $6.2 million looked less like a blessing and more like a target. I stood there in my doorway, looking at the woman who'd abandoned her 5-year-old with a backpack containing 3 items and 0 explanation, who hadn't called or written or acknowledged his existence for 11 years, who'd missed birthdays and holidays and every single diagonal toast breakfast, and I thought with perfect clarity, here we go again. Standing there face to face with my ex-wife after 11 years of absolutely nothing. No calls, no cards, no child support checks, not even a lousy text on Christmas. Was like being ambushed by a really terrible special effect from a horror movie. Except the monster was wearing Chanel and had apparently spent my son's entire childhood at hot yoga and brunches instead of, being a parent. Sabrina looked good, which honestly pissed me off more than it should have because I'd spent the last decade aging like a president during wartime. Stress lines, gray hair showing up uninvited, permanent exhaustion etched into my face, while she looked like she'd been on an 11-year spa vacation. Her hair was professionally highlighted. Her skin had that glow that comes from expensive facials and 0 parenting responsibilities, and she was wearing heels that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, which felt like a personal insult given that she'd never contributed a single dollar to Liam's care. The guy next to her introduced himself as Mr. Gerald Walsh, attorney at law, and I immediately hated him based purely on his cologne, which smelled like arrogance mixed with I win cases by burying people in paperwork. He had that slick corporate lawyer look, perfect haircut, manicured nails, suit that probably required its own insurance policy, and he was carrying a briefcase that I knew contained nothing good for me. "Mr. Brennan," he said, extending his hand like we were meeting for a friendly business lunch instead of what was clearly an ambush. "We'd like to discuss Liam's custody arrangement." I just stared at his hand until he awkwardly withdrew it, because I wasn't about to shake hands with someone who was clearly here to screw me over while pretending it was for my son's benefit. "There is no custody arrangement," I said, keeping my voice level even though internally I was screaming loud enough to register on seismic equipment. "Sabrina abandoned him 11 years ago. I have sole custody by default because she literally never came back." Sabrina had the audacity to look hurt, like I'd said something mean instead of just stating facts that were documented in approximately 75,000 scanned receipts and school forms that had my signature and never hers. "That's not exactly accurate, Noah," she said in this wounded voice that I recognized from our marriage as her "I'm the victim here" tone. "I've been supporting Liam from afar, staying involved in his life, just respecting your space as primary caregiver." I actually laughed, couldn't help it, because the sheer audacity of rewriting 11 years of abandonment as respecting my space was so absurd it broke through my anger into genuine amusement. "Supporting him from afar?" I repeated. "Is that what we're calling complete absence now? That's amazing. I've been calling it abandonment. But sure, let's go with your version." Walsh stepped in before this could escalate into a full argument on my porch, which honestly the neighbors would have enjoyed because my life had basically become their favorite reality show. "Perhaps we could discuss this inside," he suggested, already moving toward my door like he'd been invited, which he absolutely had not been. Against my better judgment, and literally every instinct screaming at me to slam the door in their faces, I let them in because I needed to know what they wanted, what angle they were playing, how they planned to spin this situation to their advantage. We sat in my living room, which suddenly felt too small and shabby, with Sabrina perched on my worn couch looking like a fashion magazine had accidentally wandered into a thrift store. Liam was still upstairs in his room, probably coding or organizing something, blissfully unaware that his mother had materialized like a bad penny after more than a decade. Walsh pulled out a folder. Of course he had a folder. Lawyers always have folders full of papers designed to ruin your day, and spread documents across my coffee table with the confidence of someone who'd done this many times before. Ms. Hartley has maintained consistent involvement in Liam's life, Walsh began, and I noticed he was using her maiden name, probably trying to distance her from the Brennan surname that was on every single school form and medical record for the past 11 years. She's made regular support payments, maintained visitation when possible, and documented her ongoing relationship with her son. He started pointing to papers, bank statements showing monthly transfers, visit logs with dates and times, even some emails that supposedly showed communication about Liam's well-being. It was all very official, very legitimate looking, and absolutely 100% fake. I picked up one of the bank statements, studied the dates, and almost laughed again because whoever had forged these had made a rookie mistake. They showed payments starting from when Liam was 5, including amounts dated to months when I'd been documenting every single expense because I was fighting for sole custody and needed proof I was the only one providing for him. These are fabricated, I said flatly. I have actual bank records, real documentation, 11 years of receipts and statements that show I paid for everything. Every therapy session, every medical bill, every diagonal piece of toast. Where exactly were these mystery payments going? Walsh didn't even blink, just moved to the next set of documents like I hadn't just accused him of presenting forged evidence. The visit logs show Ms. Hartley maintained regular contact with Liam throughout his childhood. He continued, and I looked at the dates listed: birthday visits, Christmas drop-ins, summer weekends, none of which had actually happened in any timeline I'd been living in. This is fascinating fiction, I said, standing up because I was too angry to sit still anymore. Really impressive work. But here's the thing. Liam has been with me, only me, every single day for 11 years. He's never mentioned visits from his mother because they never happened. There are no visits to log when you literally abandon your kid and disappear. Sabrina finally spoke up, and her voice had gone from wounded to determined, which meant we were moving into phase 2 of whatever strategy they'd planned. I know you've done a wonderful job with him, Noah, truly. But Liam's circumstances have changed dramatically. He's now in possession of substantial assets, and he needs proper financial guidance, legal protection, opportunities that— There it is, I interrupted, because I knew where this was going before she even finished the sentence. This isn't about Liam at all. This is about his money. You disappeared when he was difficult and resource-intensive, and now that he's a millionaire, suddenly you've been a devoted mother all along. The look on her face confirmed everything I needed to know. This wasn't a reunion driven by maternal regret or suddenly discovered love for her son. This was a calculated play for access to $6.2 million, wrapped in legal documents and lies about consistent involvement. We're prepared to file for shared custody, Walsh said, and the threat in his voice was clear even though he was still using his professional lawyer tone. We have documentation, witness statements, proof of Ms. Hartley's ongoing relationship with Liam. Unless you're willing to negotiate a reasonable arrangement. Get out, I said, and I wasn't yelling, but my voice had gone to that dangerous quiet level that meant I was about 3 seconds from completely losing it. Get out of my house with your forged documents and your threats and your sudden interest in a kid you didn't give a damn about until he had money. Walsh started to respond, probably with some legal threat about seeing us in court, but I was already opening the front door and gesturing for them to leave. They gathered their papers with that careful dignity people use when they're trying to pretend they're not being thrown out, and Sabrina paused at the door to deliver one last line. I'll see you in court, Noah, and I'll see my son. After they left, I stood in my living room staring at nothing, feeling like I'd just been hit by a truck made of legal documents and emotional manipulation. I needed to call a lawyer, a real one, not some corporate shark, but someone who specialized in family law and custody battles and understood that documentation beat pretty lies every time. I pulled out my phone and started scrolling through contacts, hands shaking slightly from adrenaline, when I heard footsteps on the stairs. Liam appeared in the doorway, and from his expression, I knew he'd heard at least some of the conversation. "That was Mom," he said, statement not question, and I nodded because there was no point lying about it. "She wants custody," he continued, and again I nodded, waiting to see how he'd react to the news that his absent mother had suddenly reappeared with legal ammunition. He was quiet for a long moment, and I braced myself for anger or hurt or fear, all the normal emotional responses to this situation. Instead, he just said calmly, "Let her talk," and there was something in his voice. This quiet confidence that reminded me he wasn't that 5-year-old on the porch anymore, wasn't helpless or voiceless or dependent on adults to fight his battles. He was 17, brilliant, and apparently had been preparing for something like this whether he'd consciously known it or not. "Let her present her case. Let her show all her evidence. Then we'll show ours." The way he said ours, with that slight emphasis, made me realize that all those years of scanning documents, organizing files, building digital archives, he hadn't just been satisfying his need for order. He'd been building a fortress of truth that no amount of pretty lies could penetrate. The courtroom smelled like bad coffee, expensive lies, and the kind of institutional despair that seeps into wood paneling after decades of families being torn apart by legal proceedings, which seemed fitting given that we were about to engage in what I could only describe as the most surreal custody battle in the history of American family law. I'd hired Donna Reyes, a family law attorney who came highly recommended by the Autism Parent Support Group I'd joined approximately 5 years. Too late. And she was this fierce woman in her 50s who'd been fighting custody cases for autistic kids since before most lawyers even knew what accommodations meant. She sat next to me at our table looking professional and confident, which was good because I was approximately 3 seconds away from a panic attack and needed someone in the room who appeared to have their life together, even if it was just an appearance. Across the aisle, Sabrina sat with Walsh and his team of associate lawyers who probably billed more per hour than I made in a week, all of them looking polished and prepared like they'd already won, and this was just a formality before they collected their trophy, which in this case was my son and access to his bank account. Sabrina had gone full devoted mother for her courtroom appearance. Modest dress that screamed, "I'm respectable," minimal jewelry, hair pulled back in a style that probably had a name like professional maternal, and this expression of dignified sadness that suggested she was the wronged party here, the mother who'd been unjustly separated from her beloved child. It was a performance worthy of an Oscar, and I hated that it might actually work because judges are human and humans are susceptible to good acting and official-looking documents. Liam sat in the gallery behind us, and I'd asked him repeatedly if he wanted to wait outside, if this was too much, if he needed to not hear whatever lies were about to be told about our lives. But he'd insisted on being present with that quiet determination he had when he'd made up his mind about something. He was wearing the one button-up shirt I'd managed to get him to tolerate, tags cut out, soft fabric, nothing scratchy, and he had his laptop bag with him, which Donna had initially questioned until I explained that Liam and his laptop were essentially one entity, and separating them would cause more disruption than just letting him keep it. Judge Patricia Morrison presided, and she had that weathered look of someone who'd seen every variation of family dysfunction parade through her courtroom and was thoroughly unimpressed by all of it. She called the case, and Walsh stood up with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing you've prepared a solid narrative backed by what appeared to be substantial documentation. He launched into his opening statement with the smooth delivery of someone who'd given this speech 1,000 times with only minor variations for specific circumstances. "Your Honor, this case is about a mother's right to be reunited with her son after circumstances beyond her control forced a temporary separation. MS. Hartley has maintained consistent involvement in Liam's life, provided financial support, and now seeks to formalize a custody arrangement that reflects her ongoing commitment to her child." I wanted to stand up and yell, "That's complete horseshit and everyone in this room should know it." But Donna had specifically told me to keep my mouth shut and let her handle the legal arguments. So I sat there gripping the edge of the table hard enough to leave marks, while Walsh painted this picture of Sabrina as this devoted mother who'd been making sacrifices and staying connected from a distance, respecting my role as primary caregiver while still fulfilling her parental responsibilities. It was masterful fiction, The kind of story that sounded plausible if you didn't know the actual facts, if you hadn't lived through 11 years of solo parenting and documented every single moment of Sabrina's absence. Then came Sabrina's testimony, and this was where the performance really ramped up. Walsh walked her through a carefully constructed narrative about postpartum depression, which I'm sure was real but had never been mentioned during our actual marriage, and how she'd needed space to heal, but had maintained contact through regular visits and financial support. She talked about birthday calls, which never happened, and Christmas presents she'd sent, which never arrived, and summer visits where she'd taken Liam to parks and museums, which existed only in whatever alternative universe her lawyers had constructed. She cried at appropriate moments, dabbed at her eyes with tissues that Walsh helpfully provided, and spoke about how much she'd missed her son and how she'd always planned to be more present once she'd gotten her mental health under control. The judge looked sympathetic, which made my stomach drop into my shoes because this was working. This elaborate fiction backed by forged documents was actually convincing someone who held the power to fundamentally disrupt the life Liam and I had built together. Walsh presented the bank statements showing monthly support payments, the visit logs documenting regular contact, emails where Sabrina supposedly checked on Liam's well-being and coordinated with me about his care, all of it fake. All of it manufactured probably in the last 3 weeks since she'd shown up on my doorstep, but looking official enough to pass casual inspection if you didn't have the real documentation to compare it against. Donna objected, pointed out inconsistencies, questioned the authenticity of the documents, but Walsh had responses prepared for everything. Explanations that sounded reasonable if you didn't look too closely, witness statements from people who'd supposedly seen Sabrina with Liam over the years. Probably friends of hers who were willing to commit perjury for whatever reason people commit perjury. Money or loyalty, or just general moral flexibility. The judge asked questions, probed certain claims, but I could see her leaning toward believing this narrative because it fit a pattern she'd probably seen before. Parents who share custody informally, maintain loose documentation, do what works without always going through official channels. Donna presented our side, my testimony about being the sole caregiver, the actual bank records showing I'd paid for everything, testimony from Liam's therapist about his needs and our relationship, school records that showed only my name on every single form for 11 years. But Walsh countered everything, suggested that I'd been gatekeeping, that I'd prevented Sabrina from being more involved, that her documentation proved she'd been trying to maintain a relationship despite my resistance. It was infuriating watching him twist reality, take my dedication and reframe it as obstruction, but I kept my mouth shut like Donna had instructed, even though every fiber of my being wanted to leap across the aisle and demand to know how these people lived with themselves. After 2 hours of testimony and arguments, Judge Morrison was looking at the stack of documents with this expression that suggested she was actually considering ruling in Sabrina's favor, or at least granting some kind of shared custody arrangement that would give my ex-wife legal access to Liam and by extension his finances. Donna was whispering to me about appeals and next steps, already planning for a loss, and I was dying inside, watching 17 years of parenting, 11 years of solo parenting, about to be dismantled by professional liars with expensive suits and forged bank statements. That's when Liam stood up. Just stood up in the gallery like he was in math class and had a question about the homework assignment, completely calm, no visible anxiety despite the formal setting, and all the eyes suddenly turning toward him. "Your Honor," he said in that flat, clear voice that carried across the courtroom, "I have evidence." The judge looked surprised. I'm guessing 17-year-olds don't usually interrupt custody proceedings with evidence announcements, but she was intrigued enough to ask what kind of evidence he was talking about. "Digital evidence," Liam replied. "Documentation of every claim made by Ms. Hartley and her attorney. I can prove which statements are accurate and which are fabricated." Judge Morrison did a double take, and honestly same, because while I knew Liam was prepared, I hadn't expected him to just volunteer himself as a witness like this was a TV legal drama, and he was the surprise expert brought in to save the case. Walsh objected immediately. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The minor child shouldn't be." But the judge cut him off with a wave that suggested she was curious about what this autistic teenager had brought to his own custody hearing. "I'll allow it," she said. "Mr. Brennan, you may present your evidence." Liam walked to the front with his laptop, connected it to the courtroom's display system with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before or had at least visualized doing it enough times that it might as well have been rehearsal. And suddenly the screen behind the judge's bench lit up with the first slide of what was apparently a presentation that would destroy 11 years of lies in approximately 15 minutes. And I sat there at the defendant's table, or plaintiff's table. I honestly couldn't remember which side we were on, thinking this is my son, this brilliant, beautiful, ruthlessly logical kid who just stood up in court to defend the only parent who never abandoned him. And I wasn't sure whether to be proud or terrified or both, so I settled on both. 6 months after the trial, Liam started a company hiring neurodivergent developers, saying, "We see what others miss." His first hires were kids everyone had written off, the ones told they'd never make it in tech because they didn't make eye contact or couldn't handle open offices. Turns out they just needed someone who got it, plus decent headphones and the option to work remotely. Sabrina got probation and community service at an autism center. I visited once, saw her reading to nonverbal kids, and she looked genuinely smaller somehow, like the courtroom had deflated whatever ego she'd been running on. She didn't apologize. Some people never do, but I caught her watching me leave with this expression that might have been regret. I didn't say anything. Some apologies don't need words, and honestly, I was tired of giving her space in my head. Liam moved into his own apartment at 18, still using that same yellow cup from when he was 5. Over dinner one night, he said, "You could have left too." I shrugged. "Yeah, but then who'd teach you sarcasm?" He smiled, a real one. "Thanks, Dad." Later, he texted, "Just verified." No clue what he meant, but I laughed anyway, because in our house, love always came with data.